I'm Robin Murphy with the Center for Robot Assisted Search and Rescue. Welcome to the Disasters and Donuts podcast, where you can learn about disaster robots and the time it takes to have a cup of coffee and savor a donut. As the wildfire seasons burn on, there's 6 lessons learned for small unmanned aerial systems and even unmanned ground vehicles. These are based on CRASAR members' collective experiences, such as the recent deployment to the California wildfires and the Kilauea volcanic eruption, as well as numerous tabletop exercises and focus groups that we've hosted or participated in. And these include with agencies such as CAL FIRE and the Department of Interior, as well as private landowners and smokejumpers. Lesson 1. If you have a small unmanned aerial system, don't fly it unless you are really, truly authorized to fly. Large wildland fires are almost always flying under a TFR, temporary flight restriction, on all manned and unmanned aircraft. And that's the equivalent of a police yellow do not enter tape, and with the same legal ramifications. The TFR makes it safer for the manned aviation, which is flying at low altitudes to evacuate people or to drop fire suppressants or to monitor the fire. And so no small unmanned aerial system can fly, even under hobbyist rules, without A, explicit permission from the agency managing the TFR, and B, approval by the FAA. And while a small UAS may not destroy a helicopter, a collision or a sudden swerve can lead to an accident. So flying an unauthorized small UAS during an event, it's not like dropping small rocks from an overpass onto the interstate. You probably won't damage the car engine, but it still might lead to a wreck. 2. That said, flying in a TFR is actually feasible. As our experiences at Hurricane Harvey show, it's actually easier to coordinate flying in a hurricane with a TFR. As long as you have an air boss, that's the director of air operations, and it's an official role in the incident command hierarchy. If you have an air boss who's knowledgeable about both manned and unmanned aircraft, then it's fairly simple for them to partition the airspace by mission, altitude, area, and come up with contingencies on how everyone can work together. And a TFR actually helps thin out the non-essential drones, though a few people will continue to fly theirs illegally, either through ignorance or whatever. A TFR can also allow small UAS to fly above the 400-foot ceiling, which is really nice. 3. Night flying is a big win for authorized small unmanned aerial systems. So recent events, as well as numerous tabletop exercises sponsored by AUVSI and CRASAR with CAL FIRE and the Department of Interior and the other agencies, they continue to highlight that drones are particularly useful at night when the fire crews are downed and manned aviation normally doesn't fly. As seen in our deployment to Hawaii, getting permission to fly at 1,000 feet AGL gives much more coverage than 400 feet, and there's less wireless dropout, and we could do it because nobody else was around. 4. Mapping's useful, but the key isn't flying. It's determining what kind of mapping is needed and how the data will be processed and by whom. And this merits talking about some more in depth. So what type of mapping is needed? There's quite a bit of difference in flying, processing, and comprehension. So do you have many decision makers that need to easily comprehend the situation? Then perhaps an app like Hangar 360, which gives a 360 panorama that's easy to understand, versus that bird's eye nadir view, which is hard for people to understand. And they can move it around over a website, which is a laptop or a cell phone, and it only requires sending them a URL. Maybe that's the way to go. But if you're flying for the GIS people and they need updated maps for geospatial analytics, then you're probably going to be using photogrammetric processing of orthomosaics or digital elevation maps, so they may be in order. What's the area to be mapped? Is it 10 acres, 100, 10,000? Large areas mean you need to be at higher altitudes and have longer range assets. You know, an in situ scan eagle or a manned aircraft can cover much more area and much more effectively than trying to piece together a quilt of areas being flown by a Mavic. And that assumes that the Mavic team could even reach the locations that were needed to map those little quilt pieces. Also, small unmanned aerial systems flying at low altitudes are great for mapping small areas of interest or hotspots. So don't forget, we're not saying don't fly small UAS for mapping. They're just not good for larger areas. And don't just fly missions. Think through the entire mapping process. Don't just fly and then drop off an unsorted SD card with an agency and say, here you go. Yep, that's happened in the past, and it's not a good end result. So put each mission on a separate folder, or even better yet, on a separate SD card, so they can know how to process that. They know what's there. Don't mix mapping and recon. Devote a flight to recon with the imagery and the video, and then fly a separate flight just for the mapping. And what post-processing will be used? Is it Data Mapper, Pix4D, EduSoft? Does the agency have a license to use that software or a way to pay for it? If the answer to those are no, then flying a mapping mission doesn't do much for them. 5. Small unmanned aerial systems may provide better image quality for local areas or help with small fires, but remember that large fires are supported by manned aircraft, higher altitude UAS, and satellite imagery. So if it's a huge 10,000 acre fire, small UAS just may not be that useful, but they may be useful for the really small ones. And things that small UAS can do is that they may be able to fly under the smoke plumes that are interfering with the imagery that's being taken from those higher altitude assets. Infrared is already being used for large wildfires. That's usually provided by manned aircraft or the higher altitude UAS and satellites. And they've been using thermal systems for many years. So there's programs where the aerial system will orbit an area, and the software imagery will determine the boundary of the fire and map that out for them automatically. So there's stuff that they can already do. Remember, those small unmanned aerial systems may be very valuable for hot spots or small fires. So think about your scale. And 6, don't forget about ground vehicles and the types of imagery that they can produce. So an autonomous ground vehicle with a ground-based system such as GroundView that can capture 3D imagery can provide rapid damage assessment. Think of it as disaster street view. Justin Adams, our president, and GroundView CEO Miles Sutherland just returned from assisting with the Shasta and Redding fires, and they collected over 100 miles of 360-degree imagery that then embeds in Esri products in just a few days. We used that during Hurricane Harvey, and the citizens of Fort Bend County loved GroundView. They could click on the little red path down their street and right there above their house and then see the state of their house. So there you have it. Just to recap, if you have a small UAS, don't fly unless you're really, truly authorized to fly. But don't be afraid to fly. Don't be put off by a temporary flight restriction. It is feasible to fly as long as you get the permissions. Night flying is a big win for those authorized small unmanned aerial systems. Mapping is useful, but the key isn't the flying part, it's everything else, determining what kind of mapping is needed, how that data is going to be processed, and by whom. Small unmanned aerial systems may provide better image quality for local areas or small fires. So remember that, but also remember that large fires are typically already being supported by manned aircraft, higher altitude assets. And finally, don't forget about ground vehicles and the types of imageries they can produce. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel and check out our website at CRASAR.org for tips and strategies for safely and rationally incorporating unmanned systems into disasters.